Great, it's 1 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. And good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We do still have some folks still joining us, but we want to go ahead and get started so we can use all of our time together as fully as we can. I'm Jeanette Butterworth with Western North Carolina Nonprofit Pathways, and we are just delighted to bring you today's webinar. I'm joined by Lakeisha McDay, who is Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Health Equity at Mission Health. And she is going to lead us through a presentation today about transforming the workplace through intentionality. You're welcome, Lakeisha. I'm so glad you're here. And before we get started, I just want to point everyone on the call to our website, to the Pathways website, which is nonprofitpathways.org. And there is a lot of information on our website about Pathways' mission, and that mission is to help strengthen the nonprofits in Western North Carolina. There are lots of information about our services and how you can connect with us. So please take a moment and check that out and get in touch if you'd like to talk further about how we can work together. And also a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. All of the participant microphones are muted. And if you have technical problems along the way, just use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, which you should see, and we'll monitor that and help you out as we can. And our time is tight, but Lakeisha will address questions as she can along the way, and then she's also reserved some time at the end of the webinar for questions. And then after the webinar, we are going to post the recording on our website, so please feel free and use that. Take it back to your boards, your staff, and share the link as widely as you'd like to so that this information can get used and can serve as conversation starters in our organizations. And then we'll also send you a follow-up email after the webinar so that you can take a very brief survey and let us know what you think, how we did, and what we can do better. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Lakeisha.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I am going to spend some time kind of covering a plethora of things today, but I hope that this presentation speaks to what you all were expecting, and we'll leave time at the end for questions, but I don't want that to stop you from asking questions. So if there are questions along the way that you have on anything that I share, please feel free to ask, and Jeanette's going to help me kind of monitor those questions coming in. So thank you, and we'll get started. So this is kind of how it's going to be broken up. We'll really give the baseline, because I don't want to make assumptions that everybody knows what diversity, inclusion, and equity is. And then we'll talk about it as a growth strategy, which may be a bit of a new way of thinking about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And then the intersectionality of it. So really the how. And then finally, measuring the way that we do the work. So diversity and inclusion, and as you can see, the two boxes kind of really break it down into a couple of different ways of thinking about it. I have often heard folks really speak to diversity and inclusion as, diversity being, I think the example they used is being invited to the party, and that inclusion is being asked to dance at the party. So diversity really is focused on that spectrum of, differences, similarities, and differences, and it's about the people, whereas inclusion really describes the way that you shape your business and how you make diversity really work, which engages your employees, which contributes to retention and those other things that we'll talk about. So equity. So as I said, the diversity is, being invited to the party, inclusion's being asked to dance. Equity is really about not only being asked to dance, but being actually asked to contribute to the playlist of the dance music. So equity is really that step further, and it's about fairness versus sameness. So as you take a look at this picture, and I'm sure you all have seen this picture, on social media and other other places, but it's really about the fact that everybody doesn't need the same thing. So how do we as employers really flesh that out within our workforce, and really probe and be curious and get to know our team members on that individual level, because again, as you look at this picture, giving everybody the same thing doesn't work. So how do we figure out what everybody needs so that they can thrive in the work that they're doing? So equity is that place that we are striving for, and should always really be the driver of any of the diversity and inclusion work that we do. It really should be, the driver should be equity and how we get to this place of achieving equity for all. So one of my favorite quotes by the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., "The time is always right to do what is right." And we know that diversity, inclusion, and equity is the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do. It's the thing that pulls at the heartstrings and makes us feel good about ourselves. And at the same time, really the value proposition is just as important. That's what's important to stakeholders, shareholders, and it sometimes is the greatest driver in our decision making. And that, that feels a little weird. I've had people say, well, diversity and inclusion, equity, it's not about the bottom line, but it actually is about the bottom line. And we want to make sure that we talk about the intersectionality of that and how it's a both and. It's not an either or, but it's really a both and. And that value proposition is really important to doing the right thing and always doing the right thing. So let's talk about the business case so diversity is the goal, inclusion is the strategy, and equity is the outcome. So if we had to break it up into three parts, so diversity is the goal, inclusion is the strategy, so that the how, right? And then equity is really the outcome, the impact, what we can measure. And so making the business case is really what you hear a lot in the tech world, in Silicon Valley and other areas of the tech world when they talk about it, because there's a lot of data, right, that really speaks to and proves that this is a great business strategy, and everybody should really be looking at it in this way. And so, to make the case why D&I is important sometimes is really frustrating and can be infuriating at times. It's almost like, what somebody can say is, convince me why an organization would want to hire women, people of color, et cetera. It's like, well, duh, why wouldn't? But it really is, people have to see it from the perspective of, again, doing the right thing and also the benefit with the business, because we know that diversity, inclusion, and equity work also can sometimes be costly. Because we're looking at recruitment, retention, what benefits we may or may not be able to provide, even looking at workspace. So it could be some additional cost, but the impact of that, the cost, the return on that cost is much greater. So it's interesting, again, how we also have to convince ourselves sometimes that, we need to see it before we know that it works. And there's a story that I heard that was shared with me, and it talked about these groups of neighbors, this group of neighbors that were gathered as they watched a house sort of burn down in front of them, but they wanted the data to prove it. And it's like, well, that's the audacity and ridiculousness of making the business case. It's kind of convincing one of the obvious, and if the smoke doesn't alarm you, the fire certainly should. And it's like, why should we have to convince people of the obvious? But we do. So let's talk about how to really build that business case and that intersectionality of how you do that. So the how you do your business, that's the intersection. That's the intersection of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And it intersects at recruitment, selection, onboarding, policy making, retention, performance management, growth and development, and even offboarding. That's how it intersects with all of those key pieces that are part of your business. Even when you're selecting a board or an advisory body, keeping those things in mind of how you want that board or that governing body to be representative of, and bring in those different ideas and perspectives in as they have that responsibility as that governing body for your business. So thinking about what your business mission is. So what's your business's mission? That's the what. And then how does that align with how you do your business? What behaviors are involved in that? What is the experience that your customer and client has? And it's often interesting that sometimes, we sort of have this mission and vision statement, in our organizations, which speaks to the what of what we do. And then, unfortunately, it sometimes doesn't align with how we do it. And so the experience that people may have, our customers or our clients, is totally contrary to kind of what our mission is. And then we also have to be able to take the time to identify what are the gaps and the barriers that exist that keep us from the how that aligns with the what. Simon Sinek, he is a behavioral researcher, and he's an author of 2 books that I love, Start with Why and Find the Why. In one of his TEDx talks, he shares this little idea that explains why some organizations and some leaders are able to really inspire that how, so the behaviors, and others aren't. And he talks about this phenomenon of that people really, they care about the what that you do. That's kind of the purpose of a purpose of your business. And they care about the results, right? But really that how and that why, that's your purpose, that's your cause. That's really what speaks to people. And why does your organization exist? So again, thinking about the intersectionality of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and those questions. Why does your organization exist? What's your purpose? What's your cause? What does your organization believe? And how do you show all of those things so that people are having the experience that you would want them to have, that your employees are having that experience, your customers and your clients are having that experience, and it aligns again with your mission. And, when diversity is managed really well, and employees are really subject to that cross-cultural diversity and inclusion, the result is that people feel validated, and they consider themselves an important part of the work. Giving employees the opportunity to work with people who bring different skills and views to the table helps them recognize that everyone is important for different reasons. Feeling valued improves the morale of the team, and it promotes positivity in the workplace. And I'm sure that you all that are joining us today can think about a time when, maybe that wasn't happening. Maybe it's somewhere that you worked previously, or, I think about my first job. I worked at Kmart, and I might be dating myself, but one of the I guess known facts about Kmart is they had these blue light specials. And so oftentimes I was the blue light special girl, and I hated it because it did not really promote that positivity. People were really mean as they were coming up if we would run out of things. And it was this horrible sort of experience, and I didn't feel really valued in what I did. So having that perspective and having your team members and employees feel valued, again, really is about that intersection, and that's the how. Different perspectives. When people with different backgrounds and cultures work together, they're exposed to varying viewpoints and ideas. And this really helps people become accustomed to hearing and sharing their different perspectives and presenting their ideas. Allowing culturally diverse employees to brainstorm brings a wide variety of solutions to the table. Sometimes I think we can oftentimes miss out when we have this sort of group think that happens, because everybody maybe around the tables is more alike than in their ideas and thoughts, and it doesn't necessarily create the type of innovation and differing thoughts and ideas. I heard this quote. I was listening to a podcast and I thought it was pretty profound. It said, "Creating unplanned collisions sparks innovation." So again, that's about bringing people with different perspectives and ideas and thoughts and experiences together. It's that intersection when we think about it, from looking at this picture. And then also thinking about how that translates to productivity for your team members. People are going to do a better job when they feel valued and included and a part of. A culturally diverse workforce is really the greatest asset that your business can have. So we think about that business case. So when your team is just cranking it out and all cylinders are firing and people come to work every day with that sense of belonging and being a part of the organization to do the work, there's a lot of work that gets done. And that speaks to, again, reducing turnover, so you're not having that added cost. It speaks to sometimes you accomplish things without having to spend the dollars because people are experts at things that we would have no idea of unless we really gauged what they bring. So let's focus on it from the perspective of recruitment and retention, so that intersectionality. So a diverse workforce, again, drives that economic growth of your organization. Recruiting from a diverse pool of candidates means a more qualified workforce. Again, it brings in all those different perspectives and experiences and those hidden talents, that can often, again, reduce our costs sometimes because somebody's an expert at it and knows how to do it. I don't necessarily have to go out and hire an IT person to come in and manage my IT systems because I have somebody on staff that's really good at that already and has that expertise. It helps avoid, again, those employee turnover costs. One of the last data pieces that I read with the research around cost of turnover, and this is really cost of turnover due to employees leaving the organizations because they don't feel valued or they don't feel like they belong in the organization. It's like 1.5 times the annual salary. So when you think about the roles that you have, sort of the median income or salary of the roles that you have in your organization, turnover costs about 1.5 times that to replace that person. And then diversity, again, fosters a more engaged, creative, and innovative workforce. It does, those collisions really spark that innovation. And it's also the cognitive diversity as well when we think about that. Cognitive diversity. So we think about from the perspective, there is this a new initiative in North Carolina called Everybody Works, NC Everybody Works. And it's looking at from the perspective of there's this untapped pool of qualified applicants in our state that are adults with intellectual disabilities that are not being tapped into. And that this is a wonderful market of employees that organizations really need to be looking at and bringing on board because, what it does, again, that intersectionality, it gives other employees and coworkers the ability to engage with someone that they may not have engaged with otherwise. And I have seen it shift the culture of organizations where inclusivity just becomes part of what you do. Like it's not even something that you have to focus on. It's just created naturally. So thinking about those untapped markets in how we recruit individuals. And then that retention piece, again, creating the space for people to really thrive in what they're good at and what they bring, what their strengths are. We know that, the homogenous, culture it can stifle growth, it can stifle innovation, it can stifle your organization. Again, it creates a lot of the groupthink and doesn't allow organizations to grow and develop. There was a recent study by Deloitte that found that when employees think their organizations are committed to and supportive of diversity and they feel included, their ability to innovate increases by 83%. That is huge. Especially, again, if you're thinking about how, when you're a small organization, how can I do more with less? It's by creating these opportunities when you're bringing different perspectives and ideas and thoughts together and gifts and talents together, that you can increase your innovation in an organization just by focusing on diversity, inclusion, and equity, just by really supporting that from the work that you do. Again, aligning your mission with the how of what you're doing. So I want to, and actually this was originally designed for an in-person instead of a webinar, but you won't be able to pair and share at this time. But I want you to think about this series of questions, and it's sort of a how am I doing with the information that I've shared so far. So I want you to think about these questions. How am I doing? And let's rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 for those questions that don't require a particular answer. So I focus on inclusion and retention prior to recruiting diverse candidates, and rate your scale sort of on a 1 to 5, 1 being not so much, and 5, obviously doing it really well. I review my job descriptions regularly to make sure they are up to date. Again, on that scale of 1 to 5. What outlets am I using to source candidates? So thinking about, where are you looking for talent? I just shared with you that untapped market of adults with intellectual disabilities, and I think there's a 74% untapped market of talent out there with adults with intellectual disabilities. So what outlets are you using to source candidates when you have openings? How am I screening out candidates? So when you are looking at resumes or applications, what drives that decision making, and who really moves on in the process and who doesn't move on in the process? So how am I screening out applicants, and what lens am I using to do that? And again, does it align? Does it align at that intersection of diversity, inclusion, and equity? And then I use a consistent interviewing technique or set of questions, and I conduct interview training if applicable. If you're a small shop, you may not have the ability to have those interview panels, but do you use those consistent interviewing techniques? Do you have a set of questions that you're asking everyone, and then you're doing that evaluation of the answer, to those particular questions? So I hope you are able to write down and just capture a couple of the answers to these, and then we can certainly talk about it once we get through the presentation, if you're willing to disclose where you may be sort of on that spectrum, and then also what you might be doing that could be helpful for others that are a part of the call. And I'm going to look, because I see a couple of chats, and I wanted to make sure there weren't questions. Oh, there was a question about the emails. Okay. All right. So also, I'm going to pause for just a moment, because we did get the question about sort of my background and how did I get here. So I wanted to share, I have been with Mission Health for 23 years, and started out actually in housekeeping as a frontline team member, and sort of, had the opportunity to grow and develop in my role across the organization. And I've been in human resources, so diversity, inclusion, and health equity is a part of human resources here at Mission Health. And I've been in this current role within HR for 3.5 years. I've been in HR for 10 years. Have sat in many different seats, from our Center for Leadership and Professional Development as a consultant, our strategic business partners. I've also been a recruiter, so I've had the opportunity to really see a lot around HR. I think the only space I have not sat in is compensation, and they probably don't want me to sit in that seat. So, so that's kind of been my journey, and how I landed really in this role was this role actually existed in our organization prior to me coming to HR, and there was some restructuring, and it moved to another area within the organization. And so about 4 years ago, my leader, with the conversation with her leader and some others, said, this really needs to be part of the strategy, right? This is the how. And so this role was recreated, and I applied, for the position, and really worked in the D&I space unofficially in my other work, around recruitment and around being that strategic business partner and helping leaders really look at their departments and their units from that holistic perspective around developing policy and procedure. And then also in the community. I have grown up in this community, so I have been involved with a lot of different things in the community that I have seen as really beneficial, or I have seen not be beneficial to the community. So, I tried to really be a part of the work that's being done, really being a part of some of those grassroots organizations, whether I volunteered or supported, monetarily, that were doing some great work around reducing disparities, around addressing, diversity, inclusion, and equity in whatever space. So that's kind of how I landed in this role. And I am a certified diversity practitioner through a national organization. And I just try to continue to learn and grow in this space and try to glean from others that have been doing this work, because it's a journey. There is no sort of arrival point. This work is a journey, and until it really becomes a part of what we do in the how, as any organization, and it's just this natural state. I think there will always be sort of the need for diversity practitioners to help us keep focused on, again, the intersectionality of the work. So let's talk about it from that perspective, the intersection with the board and that advisory structure. So thinking about, what is your board or advisory board's role in your organization? Does it have fiduciary responsibility? Is it really just an advisory board? Does it hire your highest level of employment to run the business? What really is your board's role? Does the board support the work in your organization around diversity, inclusion, and equity? Is that an ask that the board is making as far as how, again, the intersection of your work? Who makes up your board? Where are you, again, from the same perspective of employees, how are you selecting your board? Where are you looking for board members? How are you, what's the criteria for being a board member? In that selection process? And then is there any training or onboarding for a board? I think sometimes we definitely can make assumptions that, being a part of a board, people just know how to do that. It's getting in a room and we talk about the business and, we meet every quarter or every, whatever it is. But, that's really not the case. And, if there's any type of training or onboarding where the board members get to know the organization, get to know the people that work in the organization, again, understand the mission, understand how the work that you're doing, so that how and the strategy really aligns with that mission, and making sure what we're doing actually is showing up. So we're saying that we're doing something, but making sure that those are the results. And then, what interaction does your board have with staff? What's the feedback loop, for the board? Does it go both ways? Does the board give feedback to, the leader and the staff? Do the staff and the leader get to give feedback to the board? So what is that loop? What is that frequency of information that needs to be exchanged? And again, from that accountability perspective, when we think about the intersection, what's the accountability? Are there metrics? Does the board have some goals that they would like to see being met around diversity, inclusion, and and equity. So again, what are those things that we need to think about as you're looking at your board and what your board does and how your board comes together? There's also this and I'm sure everyone's heard this word culture, and culture it's hard to define, right, in an organization. But one of the definitions I found is culture is the character and personality of your organization. It's what makes your organization unique, and it sums up its values, traditions, beliefs, interactions, behaviors, and attitudes. That's what culture is. A culture is this pie of all of these things. And Peter Drucker also tells us that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we can have all the strategy in the world. We can have we can have our mission, vision, values, our organizational statement, whatever it may be. But if all of these things that are a part of culture are not aligned, it will destroy the strategy. You will not be able to meet those goals of your strategy. So culture is really important. And a vital part of that culture is belonging. So culture has visible components in a way that a business looks and how its employees dress, but it really thrives in the attitudes of your employees, of your leaders, in the setting of goals and the communication of business values. And it's funny because, as I said, this word culture is a buzzword, and it can mean a lot of different things, but it truly defines organizations in a lot of ways. And an interesting data fact is the word culture returns almost 2 billion Google search results, has almost returned 2 billion Google search results in the last year. I'm like, that's wild. Because people are trying to figure out what it is. What is this thing? And how do I transform it? And what does it take? And while many studies show that there's a direct correlation between a healthy, productive culture and a company's bottom line, the majority of companies really spend little time on thinking about it, let alone doing anything about it. Even though we know, again, that a healthy, productive culture has a direct correlation to the bottom line, to our return on investment. And culture really, it speaks to, do I belong here? Do people feel like they belong? Do people feel like that what's happening in the organization is representative of their attitudes and beliefs? Does it support their behaviors and values? Does it honor their traditions? And it's that belonging. Do I belong? Do I fit this culture? Does this culture fit me? And the reason belonging is really important to us is because we're tribal people. And one of the things that ensures the success of the tribe, and indeed, the species of the tribe, is the sense of belonging. Belonging comes from a common sense of values and beliefs. So how are you creating belonging within your organization? And I want to share with you, this came out of the Huffington Post, and this was an article that was done on the 6 essential aspects of workplace culture. And it speaks to purpose, and opportunity, success, appreciation, well-being, and leadership. And it's interesting. So I have a daughter who's now working in the real world. She's 25, and our language is really different around culture. And it's probably a generational thing. But one of the things that, I say is, life-work balance. Talk about life-work balance, and that speaks to sort of that well-being. What she says is work-life balance. And I think, the first time I heard her say that, I was like, wait, no, you're talking about life-work balance. She's like, no, work-life balance. Excuse me. She's talking about life-work balance. I'm talking about work-life balance. She said, Mom, for me in an organization, what's most important and what speaks to me is my well-being, because that's when I can come to work and do my best work. When I'm physically well, socially well, emotionally well, and I'm financially well, that's when I can come and do my best work. And I thought that was quite an interesting perspective on culture, and how culture can mean different things generationally. It can mean different things depending on where you may have been raised. It could be how you have been raised. Culture could be different based on a lot of different things. But purpose, people being able to really speak to that purpose and connecting your employees to that is really, really important. What difference am I making? What is the work that I'm doing? What difference is it making? One of the other important ones is appreciation. Acknowledging and recognizing employees' outstanding work and unique contributions. And it's figuring out that fine line of how people want to be appreciated and recognized, because it's not the same for everybody. Again, that intersectionality of diversity, inclusion, and equity. What do people need? How do people want to be appreciated and recognized? And as in leading organizations, what do I need to pay attention to with that? And give people what they need instead of this sort of the sameness that it's really about, again, what people need instead of giving everybody the same thing. So those are sort of the 6 aspects of culture that were provided in this particular article. So I have a scenario that I would like to share with you. And if you want to capture your answers on a piece of paper, and then at the end, again, we can sort of debrief and look at your answers. I definitely want to hear what some people come up with, and we can kind of talk through that. So this is like the for those of you that watch that watch television, there's a show by John Quinones called What Would You Do? And they sort of, people are put in these particular situations, and they see how people react. And so here is, I want to see what would you do in this particular situation. Again, thinking about from that sense of culture and belonging and that intersectionality. So Alyssa has a coworker, Sally, who likes to talk about politics. Alyssa does not care that much about politics, does not care much about politics all that much, but finds her coworker's political views to be a little extreme. Alyssa likes her coworker and wants to get along with her. Alyssa has thought of just pretending to agree with Sally or telling Sally that she would rather talk about other subjects. Alyssa suspects that Sally will be insulted if she goes with the second option. So what should Alyssa do? And I'll just give you a couple of minutes to, again, if you need to read through that and sort of jot down what your thoughts may be. And we'll come back at the end and sort of debrief this exercise. So I'll give you just a couple moments to do that. Okay. And again, if I need to come back to the slide at the end, so you can jot down some things, then we will do that as well. So sort of the last part really of the intersectionality is measuring impact. And this is the part that really speaks to kind of, again, creating that compelling argument or that compelling statement of why it's the right thing to do, and also from a business strategy, why it's the best thing to do for an organization. So when you're measuring impact, focus on outcomes, not just inputs. And so what I mean by that is it's not about how many sort of dollars you're putting into, maybe it's an initiative that you're doing. Maybe it's you're creating employee resource groups. Maybe it is you're going to cast the net a little bit wider in your recruitment. And so those are the inputs, right? Those are the things that you're doing. And those are all well and good and absolutely should be done. But if there's no return on that, it might cause maybe just taking a step back to look and see what's going to give the best outcome. So focus on the outcomes, not just the input. So if you, for instance, decide I'm going to take a look at all of my role descriptions that I have and really go over them and make sure that the language is inclusive, to make sure that it really gives people an idea of what's expected of them, and the, you know, what the purpose of this role is, and you know, what is you know, how is this going to make a difference in the organization, and how does it bring value to the organization. And then you do that, and you realize, you know, after doing that, that you're getting these candidates that you're like, wow, you know what, that's the outcome. So you're getting maybe a diverse talent pool or pipeline that's even interested in working for your organization. And you're able to really measure that because you knew what the role description was previously, and you know what type of applicants or the number of applicants you were getting or whatever it may be, versus, you know, once you've done something that you're seeing a shift. Measurement becomes difficult if you think about it after the fact. So it's really hard to measure something after you've done it. Number one, if you're like me, my memory fades fast now as I get a little older. So it's really important to really create what you want to measure before you start it. What is it that I want to measure? Maybe it's one thing, maybe it's two things. How do I want to measure it? What am I looking for? So what am I looking for this to tell me? What is this data what do I want this data to tell me? And what if it tells me something different? Then what? So measurement really becomes difficult if you think about it after the fact. And everything doesn't have to be measured. And I say that from the perspective of you don't have to have a chart or a graph to show the shift. Sometimes it's the fact that, gosh, we haven't had an employee raise a concern around a hostile work environment in over a year and a half. You know, maybe it is my staff, they come in and they talk to me when they have a concern, or they're coming to me with new ideas. Sometimes it's not this tangible sort of thing that again, you can create a chart or a graph for, but it's a shift, again, in what we talked about earlier, the culture. So the behaviors, the attitudes, those things. Plan to monitor incrementally, so along the way, and celebrate milestones. Don't forget to celebrate those times when you move the needle a little bit, right? Because that's really important. And sometimes we may not even arrive at that thing that we thought we wanted to arrive at. Sometimes when we're measuring success along the way, when we're celebrating those small tests of change and those victories, that we realize, hey, we need to focus more on this. And then it actually turns what you were thinking you wanted to measure turns into something else. So plan to monitor it along the way in increments, and celebrate those successes along the way. And then evaluate, does your business have a thriving or diving culture? Again, going back to the things that really make up culture and those 6 aspects of culture. Does your business have a thriving culture? Do people, again, work with purpose? Do they see that there's opportunity to learn and develop and grow and contribute? What does success, look like? And is it defined? Do employees get the opportunity to think outside the box a little bit and do things differently? One of the things that we focus on here at Mission is really honoring people in what their strengths are, what they're good at and what they like doing, and then trying to get people to do more of that. Because it's, sometimes you're just not going to be good at something, and that's okay. So it's about honoring what you bring instead of what you lack. So providing that space in your culture for people to bring their best selves and what they're really good at and that they like to do, and not sort of focusing on this area of again, what doesn't the person have. Again, that appreciation and recognition, that thriving culture, well-being, that people feel like they can take a day off, or that they can go for a walk during a lunch break and I'm not sitting at my desk, eating my lunch while I'm working. And then making sure that leadership, as leaders, you're staying connected with employees, to the purpose and empowering them to do great work and creating that sense of camaraderie and belonging and connectedness. So, I think that we all probably could surmise, if we've ever not been in a dive-in culture, we could all surmise what that might look like. And it looks much like a revolving door when it comes to talent entering and exiting our organization. It also speaks to, from the well-being perspective, people not showing up for work. So it can turn into attendance issues, like, I just don't want to be there. It can turn into more, employee relations type issues in an organization. So thinking about, again, how do you measure whether your organization is thriving or diving? And this is, I think I have to remind myself of all the time, that success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. And that was said by Winston Churchill. So again, when we think about the intersectionality of diversity, inclusion, and equity in the work that we're doing, success is not final. So we don't ever arrive at this place where we have to stop doing what we're doing or look at new ways of doing things, or say, well, this worked and we're just going to keep rolling with this, instead of identifying, what those gaps might be or what else we need to focus on. And failure's not fatal. We are human beings. We are going to mess up. We can't do it all. We can't know it all, which is why it's really important that we create, again, those collisions that spark thinking, that create the type of culture that we're thriving in. But it's not fatal. Failure doesn't mean the end. Failure just means we have a new starting point. And then it just takes courage to continue. So believing in the work that you're doing, again, that mission, that purpose, that it aligns with how you're doing that work, is what keeps us doing what we do. So that is, we're kind of at this place where I'd love to go back before we take any questions. I'd love to hear, to start with, the sort of the 5 questions, to see if there were any aha moments. So that how am I doing exercise. And I know that, I think, Jeanette, we have folks muted at this point. But I guess if you want to maybe type in to the chat, if you have a question, and we can address it that way. Would that be most helpful?
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea. We'll try it that way, and if it doesn't work, we'll figure it out a different way. But yeah, just type into the chat any thoughts you'll have on those questions.
So let me go back to the 5 questions. Let me share that on my screen. Go back to that. So how am I doing? So did anybody have the opportunity to rate themselves on, if you focus on the scale of 1 to 5, I focus on inclusion and retention prior to recruiting, and I review my job descriptions regularly.
Lakeisha, this is Jeanette, and one of the things that strikes me with this series of questions is it can be used both for staffing and also from the perspective of board recruitment.
Absolutely.
And also from volunteer recruitment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I hope you will think about this tool in any aspect, in your organization. Thank you for saying that, Jeanette. Yes, because it definitely is transferable, because you want to think about, all of those things. And you bring up even, for volunteers, I think that's a great point. As you think about people that want to come in and volunteer with your organization, whether it's, I'm volunteering so I can get some hours, I'm volunteering, per a requirement through my, education institution, or I'm volunteering because it aligns with my personal mission, that you're really thinking about all of those things. Anybody care to share sort of their thoughts on how they're doing? Or what's worked really well for you if you're doing some of this or other things? Okay. I don't see any questions yet. There's one just popped in. Okay. So this is great. I love Sally shared that they ask their final candidates to share how they connect to their diversity and inclusion statement. That's wonderful. It definitely gives you the opportunity to hear, first of all, have people sort of done their research and know that you all have that diversity and inclusion statement. And again, does it fit? Is it going to be a cultural fit? For them, because they know this is really important to you, and you speak to, it leads to transparency and open discussion, open decision making in your process. So thank you for sharing that. That's a great tip for others. That might be a question if you're not asking that in your interview process. Putting something like that in the interview process for sure. So thank you for sharing that. Valerie also said that leads to transparency and open decision making. Absolutely. I think, again, the more that we can do to, again, the how we're doing the work in that intersectionality, that people that are going to become a part of our team or are already a part of our teams and organizations, we're all on the same page, which is really helpful. So let's go over to, so I think somebody had an aha moment that they talked about, looking at some policies, which, that's a gret start. That's a wonderful start. And, I would suggest that, there's probably, other experts on this webinar today that have maybe created some things that I think would be, great content experts. And, also I'm willing to share, or if you have further questions that we could take offline, if you have further questions about policies. So the exercise, what would you do? So the ABC TV show. Anybody have any thoughts on what, in this particular situation, what Alyssa should do or what she could do? And now, oops, sorry, switched over. There's the scenario again. So what do you think? So it's interesting, this particular scenario. This is probably happening a lot in workplaces, particularly now, and. So, I think it's important, a couple of things that I thought of, and again, this is just, sort of my lens and my perspective, is, thinking about it from Alyssa's point of view and then Sally. And I often try to lead with curiosity. That's the place that I challenge myself to start, leading with curiosity. And that people don't know what they don't know. So assume good intent, even though, this person, Alyssa, feels like, or her perspective is that, Sally's political views are a little bit extreme, as her colleague, have I ever shared with her, Sally, I don't know if you're aware of this, and I'm a bit, curious, but I'm not sure that you're aware that sometimes there are policies in organizations around those discussions around politics and other things, that's really not something that should happen at work. It does. So, maybe it is, Sally, I'm not sure if you're aware, and I just, wanted you to know, because you may not have that. We do have a policy that speaks a little bit about, the conversations around politics, in the workplace, and just being mindful that there are different viewpoints, and keeping that in mind, when you decide that you want to share what you want to share. The other is, we've often heard the term that silence is agreement. That's sort of a slippery slope, because sometimes it does take courage to speak up. And if Alyssa pretends to agree with Sally by not saying anything, then, again, Sally doesn't know what she doesn't know, so she may not know that it's maybe offending, or it's just not something that Alyssa, wants to have a discussion about. And then Alyssa's also being very empathetic to the fact that she doesn't want to insult Sally by saying, I want to change the subject. So I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind, that if I'm Alyssa, to keep in mind is, again, just being curious, and instead of sort of calling Sally out, because we know that can create defensiveness, just calling her in, again, saying, hey, I didn't know if you were aware of this, or, I'd like to share this with you. I hear your perspective, and I also want to share this with you, and just ask that you consider it, moving forward. So again, that's just, from my perspective, some of the things that come up when I, again, think about from a cultural perspective, and you don't want to, have this sort of this rift, amongst, a coworker or a colleague. Now, as a leader, so to add to this question, as a leader, if Alyssa were to come to you and share this particular situation, I think as a leader, you definitely have the opportunity to address it in a different way. I have a comment that says, this is an interesting scenario as our organization engages in a lot of policy advocacy. So talking politics happens a lot, absolutely. But for our staff that aren't directly working with this angle, I wonder if there's a better way to make sure everyone feels comfortable with the positions we take as an organization. That is a great thought, especially when, like you said, you have this particular set of team members that are kind of entrenched in it and engaged in it because that's what they work on. And then you have this other group of folks that are not so much, and work at it sort of from a different angle, that everybody kind of is okay. So it may be, as I think as a leader, sometimes just checking in, especially if a team member, brings up a concern, but sometimes it's checking in. One of the things that my leader, which I so appreciate, often will check in, especially after something happens, or there's been something in the news, or it's just a hard time. She'll just often, kind of check in with us and sort of see where we are. Again, from the 6 aspects of culture, really, just gauging, where everybody is in that well-being, from that well-being perspective. And also honoring the voices. So sometimes they're the loud voices and sometimes they're the silent voices, and helping our employees really honor both. So when we think about somebody that might have an opinion about something that you maybe leading in, I appreciate you, sharing your perspective. And I also want to encourage you to be open that there might be other perspectives, if it's appropriate, if the conversations are appropriate. Sometimes, when it's conversations around certain things, those are not things that should be happening at work. So other thoughts or questions about the exercise or scenario, and any other questions that we might have for today? I see a Q&A that popped up. Okay, and I can answer this one. let's see, did I hear correctly that you mentioned that not only recruitment, training, and retaining were important, but also the way someone leaves the organization? Yes, and thank you for bringing me back to that. So offboarding. So thinking about from the perspective of having what's been traditionally called an exit interview, but I like to call it a stay interview. But just gauging, asking a few questions of the person that's leaving the organization, especially if they're leaving, on a voluntary basis versus an involuntary basis. But on a voluntary basis, to say, is there anything that you'd like to share about your experience that would be helpful, for bringing another person on board? Is there anything about this organization? What's one thing about the organization that you're really proud of? What's one thing about the organization or in your role or in your work that if you could change, you would? So that offboarding really helps in, again, moving that cultural piece around, because if there are behaviors that have been a part of this person's departure that as a leader you're unaware of, that is really helpful as you continue to do that culture work. If it is, I am in a space where we have this situation that comes up a lot. I have colleagues that are now caring for their patients. So they're caring for their parents. They're caring for their kids and they're caring for their parents. And so they need, time away from work, or there's a little more stress that's happening. Which stress piled on top of stress. So you have deadlines and things that you need to work on at work. And then there's life outside of work that isn't separate. And so it might be that I'm leaving because I need a little more flexibility. So as a leader, are there opportunities to create some flexibility, flexible scheduling, or whatever it may be in your organization? So those things are helpful. The offboarding, the exit interviews, the offboarding interviews are really helpful in continuing to evolve in an organization. So I hope that answered your question. Okay. Oh, okay, so some people can't use the chat function. I've just realized that because they're connected by phone. Jeanette, one of the things that I definitely would be willing to do, if you wanted to share my email address with the group after, you provide the slides and other things, I would be happy if they have questions, if you want, or if they wanted to send you questions and you compile them, I'd be happy to kind of put together some responses from those questions.
Great. We'll send out an email after, maybe tomorrow, if not before, with your email and any follow-up information that we need to.
Okay. And someone wanted me to share the screen again with the 6 aspects of culture. And there it is. There. And so I'll leave that up for just a moment. And then I'm not sure, when I open the chat box, can you see that, Jeanette?
Yes, I can see it because I have it opened. I believe everyone can see it. If not, let us know.
Okay. Because I wanted to read one, but I didn't want to cover up this slide. Because somebody asked, could I show this one?
It's probably best to read it because there are folks on the phone.
All right. It says, this is from Matt, who says, our school culture has an expectation of extremely high work ethic. This is challenging for marginalized individuals such as parents or those seeking support outside of the work community, i.e. counseling, support groups, etc. The school also historically struggles with staff retention. How can we get away from an insular competitive work environment and be more supportive and accommodating, especially for those with higher personal needs? Wow, that is a question, Matt. And I think I need a little bit of time maybe to think about that, if it will be okay with you. I can get your email address from, do you have the participants' email addresses, Jeanette?
I do, yeah.
Okay. If I could get your email address from Jeanette, and I would love to take a deeper dive into this, this particular question, if that's okay. So any additional thoughts or questions or, okay, thanks, Matt. I want to make sure that, and I hope that again, if you have questions, that you will send those in to Jeanette, because I want to make sure that you get out of this particular time together, what you were looking for, or if it provokes other thoughts or questions that you might have. Okay, thank you, Christopher, for joining. All right. So Jeanette, how would you like to close out the space?
Great. Well, if you could go to that next slide. Is there a next slide of our
yes,
wonderful funders?
Yes.
I want to say thank you to all of our funders who fund Pathways, so that we can bring you presentations like this and workshops and training. So all of those wonderful folks are listed right here, and I believe we have Valerie Stewart on the call also. So thank you, Valerie, for being with us and for supporting Pathways work, and especially the work of nonprofits throughout the region. And I also want to just remind y'all that we will be sending a survey, so please just take a moment and fill that out, send it back to us. And thank you, Lakeisha. I appreciate you coming back to us. This was originally a mini workshop that we were going to add on to our compliance update, but due to circumstances outside of our control, Lakeisha was not able to be there that day. And so I appreciate you coming back and providing us with this information.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there was one, let's see, Valerie, you had a question about how many culture champions do you have, and how do we hold staff accountable to the work of building? So I'd love to talk further about that with you. And actually, so we currently have a diversity council within our organization, and it's made up of team members from all over the region. So all 6 hospitals that are embedded champions. So they have a first job, which may be a nurse or a environmental services tech, and then they're also a part of this council as diversity champions. But I'll definitely come back to you on that question. I can send you an email, or we can chat by phone.
Lakeisha, there is one question that I would like to just pose, and hopefully it's not too big of a question at the end, but if it is, maybe we can follow up over email. But, a lot of folks working in nonprofits are working in very rural communities where building diversity is difficult.
Yes. Oh,
and
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how we can think about that and how we can talk about it and celebrate, the diversity that we are able to build, and just give us some tips on how we can be thinking about that in an appreciative way going forward.
Absolutely. And one thing that I want everybody to think about too is while diversity is defined in a way, it's not always about representation, right? So diversity could be that you have different generations, right? That you have, so if you have a majority white community, it's going to be hard to, create some diversity as far as representation. But within that community, do you have generational differences, life experience differences? Maybe there are areas of expertise and difference. And also at the same time, you want to, can you create diversity by having accountability and openness for those less representative, maybe boards or stakeholders, to be open to learning more about others, right? So how do you create, when you have a majority in-group, how do you create diversity within that in-group? And sometimes it's just, again, by exposure. Some of the community work can be done by, exposure to different things that are happening in other communities. We have 6 hospitals within Mission Health, and many of them are located in rural locations where diversity around race and ethnicity are are just, the numbers are not there. However, when we look at how we can connect, so, my role is to connect the larger health system to the diversity, inclusion, and equity. So how do I create this? How do I create or broaden the perspective even when it may not be representative? So is that helpful?
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
it is.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lakeisha, and thank you, everybody, for being on the call with us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and we will sign off here. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.